Hello learners, welcome to the session on PG Diploma in Environmental Health and Environmental and Occupational Health program. The course is MEB 001 and this is block 1, Environment and Ecology, and in that block today we are going to talk on unit 2, which is on ecosystems. Specifically we will be talking about biogeochemical cycles. Let me give an outline of today's session. We shall talk about what is an ecosystem, then ecosystem, its structure and function, ecosystem aspects which will deal with energy flow and material cycling, and then we will come on to what are biogeochemical cycles exactly. And in this session we will talk about two cycles. These are hydrologic and carbon cycle. So all of you are aware and you know it very well, what are the various components of our environment. So we know that there are generally 4 components. We have atmosphere, which deals with the gases around the earth. We have biosphere, which is related to all the life forms on this planet. We have geosphere, which is the upper mantle crust of earth, and hydrosphere, which deals with the oceans, rivers and other water bodies. Besides these 4 spheres or the regions of environment, we have created another, we call it anthrosphere, which is a man-made sphere which deals with the technology, that is the developments which we have made ourselves. So let's start with what is an ecosystem. So ecosystem is basically a subset of ecology, and ecology is the word which arises from oikos, and which means a home or estate. Logos is the study. So study of home or household of the nature. Tansley in 1935 defined it as the ecosystem was the system resulting from the integration of all living and non-living factors of the environment. But the latest definition of ecosystem is that it is the scientific study of the relationship of the living organisms with one another and the environment. So there are some basic facts which you may be knowing, but then let's revise. So basically energy and carbon enter ecosystems through photosynthesis and are incorporated into living tissues. We know that the whole all the living beings are made up of carbon, and we derive energy from sun. And this basically is transferred to other organisms that feed on the living and dead plant matter and are released through respiration. And most of the mineral nutrients are recycled within the ecosystems. So what is the structure of our ecosystem and what are its functions? So basically the ecosystem is made up of 2 components. One is biotic, another is abiotic. So biotic is all the living organisms compose or they build the biotic part, and abiotic is basically the physical and chemical characteristics of the environment. So what are the functions? We know that ecosystem is very important for the sustenance of life for all who are dwelling in this planet. So the functions depend on sun's energy, and this is the energy that flows in the system. And what does it comprise of? It comprises the food chains, webs, trophic levels, and amongst these, the energy flows. The productivity, the biogeochemical cycles and the ecosystem regulation are also part of its functions. So food chain we know very well. Food chain is the linear relationship where we know that who eats what. We have primary consumers, we have primary producers. The primary producers are consumed by the primary consumers. and the primary consumers are consumed by secondary consumers and then tertiary and so on and so forth. So we call these levels as the trophic levels. They are related to the food part of living beings. Then food web is also a related component where all the trophic levels interact. So this is not a linear relationship, but all food chains interact, and that is what is called as a food web. So let's know more about the energy flow in the ecosystem, because after all, every living being for that matter needs energy for the sustenance of life. So this energy depends upon the sun's energy for the functions, and it is this energy that flows in the system. And food chains, as said earlier, webs, trophic levels, productivity, biogeochemical cycles and ecosystem regulation form the part of this energy flow. So besides energy flow, we have nutrient cycles in the ecosystem. The nutrient cycles are the cyclic processes that involve the movement of nutrients from the physical environment to living organisms and back to the environment. So it's a cyclic process. Let's see how energy flows within an ecosystem. The energy stored in organic molecules can be passed to other organisms in the ecosystem. When the organisms eat plants or other organisms that have previously eaten those plants, the consumers or heterotrophs are the other feeding organisms of an ecosystem rely on the ecosystem's producers for energy. The consumers include the herbivores, carnivores and the decomposers. How does energy flow and material cycling interrelate is shown very clearly in this diagram. As you can see, these are depicted by colored arrows. So the yellow and red arrows show the energy flow. Yellow is the usable energy. As said earlier, sun is the source of all energy to all the ecosystems. And as we can see, the whole ecosystem, it gets energy from sun, and some of this energy is used by the ecosystem dwellers, in the sense the living beings which are in the ecosystem, and rest is lost as the heat. So red here in this diagram indicates the energy lost in the unusable form of heat. The green arrows here show the continuous recycling of chemical nutrients. So there is a very important related term with ecosystem. We call it ecological efficiency. What is ecological efficiency? See, producers absorb energy from sun, and only 50%, around 50% of energy becomes part of the plant's body. You know that plants are the primary producers in this ecosystem. So only 50% is being utilized. Rest 50% is used for living or lost as heat. So what happens is, at each trophic level, the energy stored in an organism is about 1/10. As energy decreases at each trophic level, few ecosystems contain more than 4 or 5 trophic levels. So this energy flow is a consequence of two fundamental laws of thermodynamics. What are these laws? So the first law of thermodynamics states that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. It can only be changed from one form to the other form. The second law states that when energy is transformed from one form to another, there is always some loss of energy from the system. Usually it is a low grade heat. So these two thermodynamic laws are governing the energy flow of the ecosystem. So what is ecological efficiency is depicted in this energy pyramid. It follows a 10% rule. Roughly 10% of the energy at one level will be available to be used by the next level. and there is an obvious energy loss. The farther up the trophic levels, that is roughly 10% efficiency or a 90% loss in energy for each level is observed. So you can see in this diagram the energy, the producers have 100% of energy, which gets reduced to only 10% energy, then 1% and 0.1% and so on and so forth. So how does it vary in the trophic levels is the ratio between the energy assimilated and the energy used with trophic levels of food chain is known as ecological efficiency. And as can be seen in this diagram, there are various trophic levels, and at the stage of, suppose the producers, the primary producers, if it is 20,000 kilocalories, so by the time it goes to primary consumers, it gets reduced to 2,000, and then we have secondary consumers. But as we move up in this food chain or the web, it keeps getting reduced. So this is how we describe the ecological efficiency. Then we come to what is basically the focus of our session, that is ecosystem and biogeochemical cycles. So ecosystem has two components. We said biotic and abiotic. Besides that, some of the components are formed by the chemicals, and these chemicals are associated to the geologic processes. That's how it is called biogeochemical also. And for the sustenance of the ecosystem, the chemicals or the compounds must be recycled. And this is explained by the biogeochemical cycles that exist in nature. And these cycles show how the energy is used in conserving the biomass. So what are biogeochemical cycles? A biogeochemical cycle is the movement of nutrients and other elements between biotic and abiotic factors. That is, mineral nutrients get cycled in the ecosystem to maintain a dynamic system. It involves geologic processes also in the cycle, and the geologic processes are like weathering of rocks, erosion, water drainage, subduction of continental plates, all play a role in the recycling of materials. So what is nutrients recycle? Movement of nutrients from the physical environment to living organisms and back to the environment. As I said, that it is a cyclic process. So out of the 103, only 24 are required by organisms, known as macronutrients and micronutrients. The fundamental macronutrients include carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus and sulfur, and we abbreviate these as CHNOPS. Besides that, of course, water being the central is also there. So what are the benefits of this nutrient cycle? This is basically because a cyclic process, whatever is being consumed is being again, sent back to the system. So the benefit of nutrient recycle is that it reduces the accumulation of waste that can cause pollution, and also the ecosystem will not be exhausted of essential elements because these are being replenished. For example, oxygen is an output of the plant photosynthesis, which is important for respiration in higher animals and food for the consumers, whereas carbon dioxide released by the consumer is a nutrient for green plants. So that's how it is a cyclic and a usable process. Now we come to the biogeochemical cycle. There are a number of cycles which are important to the whole ecosystem. These are hydrologic, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur and phosphorus cycle, which we would discuss in these sessions. We start with hydrologic cycle. So all of us are familiar also. Hydrologic cycle is one of the very important cycles. All of us know that water is not only the component of this planet, but also of our living system, of our living system in the sense of our body. So hydrologic cycle, which is related to completely water, is also called the water cycle. It is a continuous movement of water from the ground to the atmosphere and back again. And it is defined as the cyclic process of evaporation, cloud formation, rainfall, snowfall and refilling of water bodies. The cycle involves movement of water from the oceans to atmosphere by evaporation, and from atmosphere to oceans to land by precipitation, land to oceans by runoff from streams and rivers and subsurface groundwater flow. The process of hydrologic cycle is again it starts with the sun or the solar energy and wind, as these are the main causes of evaporation. Until and unless water evaporates, the cycle will not begin. So during the hydrological cycle, there is transfer of heat around the earth, moderating extreme conditions of temperature. The stages in hydrologic cycle are evaporation, transpiration, interception, precipitation, runoff and infiltration. We shall see what all these mean. So evaporation is the water from soil surface, ponds, lakes, rivers and oceans which gets transferred as moisture to the atmosphere. And the factors affecting evaporation are temperature, relative humidity, wind velocity, amount of rainfall or snowfall, quality of water, surface area of the water, source and sunshine, etc. So these factors better the evaporation or formation of the moisture. Then we have transpiration. So transpiration is different from evaporation in the sense that it refers to loss of water in vapor form from the plant leaves. So water taken into the roots of the plants from the soil replaces the transpired water. So evapotranspiration is another process in this cycle. It is like the action of a pump absorbing water from the soil and leaving the vapor into the atmosphere. Water loss from a vegetated area takes place both by evaporation and transpiration, hence this term evapotranspiration. Then we have interception. Interception is the retention of precipitation by thick vegetation of trees and plants or by shrubs that is evaporated back to atmosphere. So because of these too much of vegetation, the rain which is falling is retained and it does not go to the groundwater or ground. Very less rain reaches the soil directly and it is generally seen in low rain areas. So precipitation is the process of conversion of water vapor into liquid state and it signifies rainfall and snowfall. Water returns to the land and sea from the atmosphere by means of condensation and deposition. Condensation is the process of conversion of water vapor into liquid state like the dew droplets. It's a very common observation. Every day we observe this, and deposition is the process by which water vapor changes into ice crystals. In the atmosphere, tiny droplets of water and ice crystals form the clouds. Runoff. So some of the rainfall is soaked into the soil as groundwater, and the excess water that flows over the land surface along the natural slope of area is the runoff. And it is the main source of water for lakes, streams and rivers. And in runoff, of course, the rainwater ultimately drains into the sea. Soil characteristics that influence the rate and magnitude of the runoff are smoothness and steepness of the slope. With obviously smoothness and steepness, the runoff will be better. So infiltration is the absorption of part of the precipitation by the surface layers of the soil. During infiltration, water moves downward vertically through various layers, finally forming the groundwater. Infiltration depends upon the intensity of rainfall, the surface conditions of the soil, whether there is concrete or it's being absorbed well. Vegetation cover, if it is too much, then there is a lot of retention, otherwise the rain comes down and refills the groundwater. Available storage capacity also. So this is how whatever processes we've talked can be depicted by this particular diagram. You may be very familiar with this. So it shows how evaporation is taking place, or the rainfall, evaporating in presence of sun, coming back to the soil, going up again, and then coming in the form of rain. So by this hydrologic cycle, we are able to get back whatever was being lost in the form of vapors. What is the impact of hydrologic cycle? See, water cycle affects all life processes on earth. During precipitation, water vapors and droplets take dust, bacteria, industrial soot particles and smoke that help in pollution reduction. That you must be very well aware. If you want to reduce pollution, we are spraying water, which gets along with it a lot of pollutants. Without the evaporative cooling effect of the water cycle, the temperature on the earth would rise drastically. The water cycle is also an integral part of other biogeochemical cycles. So carbon cycle. Carbon is very, very essential to the whole living system, because our body systems, or there are the plants or animals, anybody, living, non-living, you will find carbon everywhere. And all living organisms, they contain carbon atoms because of its unique chemical stability. You must have read that carbon has a property of catenation, by which it is able to form bonds with other 4 atoms. And not only, polymeric compounds are formed, and so it is very, very essential. It is the building block of life and anchors all the organic substances. The carbon compounds exist in solid, liquid and gaseous forms. So carbon in nature exists in the form of storage reservoirs. We have 2 types of reservoirs. One we call as carbon sink. When more carbon is absorbed than released, more carbon is accumulated and stored. So this is called as carbon sink, which has a lot of carbon coming from outside sources. We have plants, oceans and soil. Then we have carbon source, where more carbon is emitted than stored. Because carbon source will give a lot of, like burning of fossil fuels will give a lot of carbon dioxide and organic matter, weathering of limestone rocks, all volcanic eruptions and other human activities. All of these give out a lot of carbon in the form of its oxides or otherwise. So carbon cycle is basically the movement of carbon atoms in different forms through the reservoirs and grouped into biosphere, which will comprise of the living and dead organisms, geosphere, which is the solid part of earth, that is rocks and minerals, pedosphere, which is the outermost layer of earth, hydrosphere, total water on earth, atmosphere, layers of gases around the planet. So the components of carbon cycle, there are 2 components: fast carbon cycle, which involves biologic processes such as photosynthesis and decomposition. Then we have slow carbon cycles, which involve transition of inorganic carbon such as weathering of rocks and soils. Weathering takes years altogether for the rocks and soil to weather. The processes of carbon cycle involve these stages: atmospheric carbon, which has carbon dioxide and methane. This is absorbed by plants, and the plants are consumed by animals and humans. Animals and humans die and decompose, by which carbon is released back into the atmosphere, and the remaining carbon becomes fossil fuels. These fossil fuels are used for man-made activities, and carbon is released back into the atmosphere. So this can be depicted in this particular diagram. We can see that how is carbon being recycled, consumed, produced, and so forth. In marine ecosystems, this carbon cycle starts with the absorption of carbon dioxide from inorganic carbonates of seawater by phytoplankton and macroalgae. The sea plants carry out photosynthesis and enter the marine food web. Respiration by plants and decomposition takes carbon dioxide to atmosphere and back to the ocean as carbonates. What is the significance of carbon cycle? All life forms on earth are based on carbon, as said earlier. So carbon is an integral component of every important biomolecule, like carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and most importantly, the genetic material, that is DNA. It plays a vital role in balancing the energy and traps the long wave radiations from the sun. If the carbon cycle is disturbed, it may lead to climate changes and global warming, as all of us know how the global warming is being, so dangerous. So in this particular session, let me summarize. We talked about ecosystem, which is the interaction of biotic, non-biotic components with the surroundings. And the ecosystem uses energy from the sun, which flows within the system. This ecosystem is sustained by the biogeochemical cycles, and because these involve the chemicals as well as the geologic processes. And here we talked about the hydrologic cycle, which is a continuous flow of water from ground to atmosphere and back. Then we talked about the carbon cycle, which is the flow of carbon atoms in different forms through the reservoirs, that is the sink and the source. So we will talk more, more biogeochemical cycles in our other session. Thank you for right now.